It was one of those damp London mornings when the mist clung low over Baker Street, muffling the usual bustle and reducing passing carriages to spectral shapes on the cobbled road. The hearth in our sitting room crackled modestly, but Sherlock Holmes paid it no mind. He was sprawled upon the settee, fingers pressed steeple-like beneath his chin, eyes half-lidded in that peculiar state of wakeful meditation he often assumed between cases. For my part, I had taken to rereading The Lancet, still dressed in my dressing gown, the Morning Post unopened beside me. It had been 3 weeks since our last investigation, the matter of the vanished governess from Putney, and I dared to think that Holmes was growing restive. His violin had remained untouched for days, and he had not so much as criticised Inspector Lestrade in over a week. That was when Mrs. Hudson entered with the announcement that we had a visitor, a young woman, distraught, dressed in a peculiar fashion. "Send her in," Holmes said without lifting his eyes. The woman who stepped into our chambers was perhaps 25, slender and tightly composed, though her eyes betrayed sleepless anxiety. What struck me most, aside from her trembling gloved hands, was her attire. She wore not one but 2 veils, a thin gauze of white lace that clung softly to her features, and beneath it another veil, darker, more opaque, which shielded her lower face from chin to chest. Holmes rose and gestured toward the chair nearest the fire. "You have come to us in distress," he said, his voice calm and almost kind. "Please remove your gloves, Mrs. she corrected, her voice muffled by the veils. "Mrs. Alice Carraway." She removed her gloves obediently. Her fingers were pale, and the 4th finger of her left hand bore a plain gold wedding band, new, unworn, its polish yet unsmudged by time. "I have come because I believe my husband is not who he claims to be," she said, "and I fear that if I pursue the matter further, I may find myself silenced." Holmes leaned forward slightly, the gleam of interest rekindling in his eyes. "Go on, madam. Begin at the beginning." She clasped her hands tightly in her lap. "I was married just 3 days ago. The ceremony was conducted in a private chapel near Richmond. It was to be a quiet affair. My family objected to the match, you see. But I was very much in love, or thought I was. The man I married called himself Edward Carraway. He is, or claimed to be, a merchant newly arrived from Antwerp. We met through a friend at a literary salon," Holmes interjected gently. "And when did you begin to suspect irregularity?" Her voice dropped. "On the night of our wedding, he locked the bedroom door from the inside and slept on the chaise longue." Holmes's eyes narrowed, but he said nothing. "The next morning," she continued, "he insisted I not leave the house without a veil. 2 veils, in fact. He said it was a tradition from his native customs that a wife's face must be hidden until a certain ritual was completed. When I pressed him for more, he grew stern, not angry, but cold. And since then, we have not spoken more than a few words. He leaves at dawn, returns after midnight. I've not seen him fully in daylight. And yesterday—" She paused, her hands tightening. "Yesterday, I discovered a second marriage certificate. Hidden behind the baseboard in the drawing-room, Holmes's eyes glittered. "And this second certificate?" "It bore the same name, Edward Carraway, but a different bride. A woman named Lydia Glass, married 3 months ago." For the first time, Holmes stood and began to pace. "You are in danger, Mrs. Carraway," he said briskly, "and your husband is either a bigamist, an impostor, or worse. Have you shown this to the police?" She shook her veiled head. "I didn't dare. He watches everything. He has a manservant who—" "Say no more," Holmes interrupted. "Watson, you will accompany Mrs. Carraway back to her residence. Remain with her until I arrive." I shall make certain inquiries. But Holmes, I began, we know nothing of this man, not even if Edward Carraway is his real name. Precisely why I must make haste, he replied, already reaching for his coat. There is something about this arrangement, the dual veils, the evasiveness, the hidden record of another bride, that suggests not only deception, but premeditated concealment of a very specific sort. He turned to Mrs. Carraway. Madam, you have done wisely to come to me. You must not return alone. Dr. Watson will keep you company until I am certain your household contains only one mystery. And then, with a flourish of his Inverness cape and the click of the front door, Holmes vanished into the fog. The carriage rattled through the fog-drenched lanes of Richmond, the heavy mist curling through trees like creeping fingers. I sat opposite Mrs. Carraway, who remained veiled and silent, her gloved hands resting motionless in her lap. Though I longed to reassure her, Holmes's urgency lingered in my mind like a refrain, and I resolved not to underestimate the seriousness of the matter. Holmes had often remarked that a woman's instinct, when sharpened by fear, could be more reliable than Scotland Yard's entire forensic division. And something in Mrs. Carraway's composure, her manner of speech, the poised restraint in her distress, spoke not of hysteria, but of clarity. The house stood detached and brooding at the end of a gravel drive, surrounded by hedges tall enough to obstruct any neighbour's view. Not large by the standards of the wealthy, but the architecture had a peculiar austerity, an absence of character that struck me as oddly intentional, as though the very walls sought anonymity. A servant opened the door, a sallow-faced man in a worn black coat whose name, Mrs. Carraway, whispered was Sims. "I shall retire to my room," she murmured to him, voice muffled beneath her veils. "This is Dr. Watson. He is a guest of Mr. Carraway." The man gave me a long, expressionless glance before nodding curtly and withdrawing. Mrs. Carraway led me into a small drawing-room off the front hall, modestly furnished, almost impersonal. A fire had been laid, but not lit. She motioned to a settee, and I took the seat, watching as she moved with deliberate care, as though even within her own house she feared being overheard. "He often returns between midnight and 1, she said softly, pulling the heavier veil aside. In the soft lamplight, her features emerged more clearly, fine cheekbones, tired eyes, and lips that quivered despite her effort at self-control. "You mentioned a second marriage certificate," I said. "May I see it?" She rose, walked to a small console table beneath the window, and produced a folded document hidden beneath a vase of dried flowers. I took it in hand, unfolding the yellowed parchment with care. The handwriting was similar to what I recalled from my medical experience with legal forms, neat, dated, and official. This certifies that Edward Carraway and Lydia Glass were lawfully wed on the 14th day of June in the parish of St. Aloysius, Paddington. No red flags on the surface, no erasures or mismatched fonts. A second wedding, no doubt. But whether it was genuine, fraudulent, or symbolic remained unclear. "Have you confronted him?" I asked. "No, I feared what he might do, and besides—" She hesitated. "He's never here long enough to question. He vanishes for hours. He carries no key, yet always returns silently." "You mentioned a manservant." "Only Sims?" "Yes, and a cook who left last week. He dismissed her after one of the pantry locks was found broken. Since then, he has insisted on taking most of his meals out." "A locked pantry?" I repeated. "Yes," she said. "He keeps the door barred. Told me it contained medicines too dangerous to leave unsecured, but I don't believe that now." Just then a sound interrupted us, the low creak of a floorboard above. We both froze. Mrs. Carraway's eyes darted upward. She rose and crossed quickly to the door, listening. "Sims's quarters are downstairs," she whispered. "That wasn't him." I stepped into the hall, glancing toward the staircase. The fog outside pressed close against the front windows, diffusing the lamplight and making the upper landing appear like a shadowy stage awaiting its players. "Is there anyone else in the house?" I asked. "No, not to my knowledge." Before I could ascend the stairs, a door above creaked open. A figure emerged, tall, slight of build, dressed not in servant's attire but in a dark frock coat. The figure paused at the top of the stairs, a gloved hand resting on the banister. For a moment our eyes met. "Ah," came the smooth, measured voice. A guest. How rare it was, Edward Carraway. His face was narrow and angular, with eyes that held a studied calm, like those of a chess player in mid-game. His hair was slicked back, and despite the lateness of the hour, he was impeccably dressed, save for a speck of dust on his lapel. "Good evening," I said evenly, stepping forward. "Dr. John Watson, I'm here by invitation." He descended slowly. "Of course. My wife has always had an interest in unusual company." He reached the bottom stair and extended his hand, cool, dry, precise. "May I ask your profession, Doctor?" he said as we shook. "Formerly of the Army Medical Department, now companion to Mr. Sherlock Holmes." His lips twitched slightly, somewhere between amusement and tension. "Then I am honored?" Though I must admit I was unaware my marriage had attracted the attention of detectives. He turned toward Mrs. Carraway, who stood just behind me, her veil now restored. "I assume this visit was your doing," he said to her with a smile that never reached his eyes. She did not answer. "My wife," he continued, "has always been prone to imaginative episodes. Though charming, they tend to escalate." I bristled. "Sir, your wife's concerns are valid and warrant proper investigation." He raised an eyebrow. "Investigation? Surely you jest. Are we speaking of some minor domestic misunderstanding? Or has she claimed I possess a hidden chamber filled with skeletons?" "She has shown me a marriage certificate," I said. "Another one." With another name, his face did not change, but the pause that followed was significant. "Interesting," he said at last. "Then she has been snooping again?" He turned to her, this time more sharply. "You were told never to go into the drawing room unsupervised." Her voice trembled, but did not waver. "I had to know what you were hiding." A silence stretched between them. At last he sighed and turned back to me, once more, the urbane gentleman. "Doctor, I regret the misunderstanding. I'm certain you and your friend Mr. Holmes will find this all rather mundane in the end." He looked at the clock. "But since you're here, do stay for supper. Sims is already preparing something tolerable. I must step out briefly, business of the merchant variety. I'm sure I'll return with my honor intact." With that, he swept up his coat and hat and left, shutting the door behind him with deliberate calm. The moment he was gone, I turned to Mrs. Carraway. "He's lying," I said. "I know," she whispered. "But about what?" I looked back toward the staircase. "We'll find out soon enough." Once Edward Carraway had departed into the damp Richmond night, a silence settled over the house, not the comfortable quiet of repose, but a tense, almost expectant stillness. Mrs. Carraway stood near the fire, her fingers trembling as she removed her veil and folded it neatly, though the motion seemed more an effort at distraction than tidiness. "I don't know where he goes," she murmured. Sometimes he returned smelling faintly of smoke, not tobacco, but something harsher. Once I thought I detected a trace of embalming fluid. Another night, ink and lacquer, I furrowed my brow. And he gives no explanation. Only vague mutterings about imports, consignments, urgent papers from the continent. But he receives no correspondence, no telegrams. Nothing. I glanced toward the hall where Sims had vanished after greeting us. The man had barely blinked. There was something oddly inorganic about his stillness, like a man trained not to move unless instructed. "Have you ever attempted to enter the pantry he keeps locked?" I asked. Mrs. Carroway nodded slowly. "I tried once, with a hairpin. The lock was too complex. Afterwards, I found my bedroom window nailed shut from the outside. A message, I suppose, a chilling one. I stood and crossed to the drawing-room door, peering into the dark corridor. The house felt larger now that Carroway was gone, as though his presence had kept certain shadows at bay or confined. I gestured to Mrs. Carroway to remain behind, then moved cautiously toward the kitchen. The layout of the house was straightforward: 2 stories, 4 upstairs rooms, and a ground floor comprising the drawing room, dining room, kitchen, and what she had referred to as the private pantry. The kitchen, though plainly appointed, bore signs of recent use. A half loaf of rye bread sat on the cutting board, beside a darkened knife and an opened jar of anchovy paste. Then I saw it, the pantry door. It was of heavy wood, reinforced with iron bands and secured with a brass lock far more robust than the rest of the house required. I bent to inspect it more closely. The mechanism was indeed intricate, a 4-lever mortise lock, no doubt custom-fitted. "Dr. Watson?" came a soft voice behind me. I turned, startled. Sims stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable. The man was so pale he seemed more apparition than servant, his gaunt frame barely making a shadow. "I trust the master has given his permission for you to examine the private stores," he said, voice devoid of inflection. "I am here at the request of Mrs. Carroway," I replied, matching his tone. "And I have reason to believe there are matters in this house that require close scrutiny." He tilted his head like a curious bird. "I am merely a servant. I tend the fire, clean the floors, and prepare the master's meals. What lies behind that door is not my affair. Do you know what is stored within?" "I do not ask questions," he said, "and I suggest, sir, that you adopt the same prudence." I stepped back, letting the implication settle between us. Sims turned without another word and disappeared down the corridor. I returned to the drawing room. Mrs. Carroway was seated once more, her eyes fixed on the fire, its flames barely licking the logs. "There's something unnatural about that man," I said. "He's too watchful." "He obeys Edward without question," she said. Once I dropped a vase and it shattered. Within minutes, Sims was sweeping it up. "I hadn't called him. Perhaps he listens at doors." She gave a faint nod. "There are no locks on the interior rooms, only on the pantry and the cellar. And now my window, I made note of that. A locked cellar, too. The grandfather clock in the hallway struck 9. A chill wind scraped the windows, and I could hear the distant bark of a dog, muffled by fog. It was then I heard the low whinny of a horse and the crunch of wheels on gravel. "Holmes!" I said, rising. I stepped to the front door and opened it. A tall figure emerged from the mist, familiar in posture and stride. Holmes, with his coat buttoned high, a slim parcel beneath one arm. "Ah, Watson!" he said briskly as he entered, shaking moisture from his hat. "I trust you've kept our hostess company." "I've had a most illuminating hour. Did you learn anything of Edward Carroway?" I asked as I took his coat. Holmes gave a dry smile. "That no such man exists in Antwerp, at least not in the shipping registers or any business circles, and the name appears on no dock manifests from the past 6 months. Then who is he?" "A man playing a part," Holmes said, "and perhaps not for the first time." He turned to Mrs. Carroway and bowed slightly. "Madam, I believe your instincts are sound. Your husband is a fabrication, but of what kind we've yet to determine. She sat upright. You mean he is not Edward Carraway at all? I mean the name is a costume. The man inside remains hidden. Holmes placed the parcel on the table and unwrapped it. Inside was a small crowbar, a leather satchel, and a skeleton keyring of peculiar design. I intend to see what lies behind the pantry door. I led him to the kitchen. Holmes knelt before the lock, inspecting it with careful precision. He hummed softly as he tested several keys. Ah, he muttered, French, probably from Lyon? Ingenious, but not infallible. There was a click, a soft squeak of hinges, and the door opened. What lay within was unexpected. Rows of shelves lined the walls, meticulously organized, labeled with typewritten tags. But these were no preserves or kitchen staples. There were glass bottles containing strange powders, folded robes of pale linen, an anatomical chart pinned to the far wall, and, most chillingly, a wax mask of a woman's face resting atop a silk cushion. Holmes's face darkened. "This is no pantry," he murmured. "It is a laboratory." Or perhaps a wardrobe for assumed lives. I leaned in. Beneath the mask, in a locked cabinet now ajar from Holmes's toolwork, were several identity cards, passports, and forged legal papers, each bearing different names, but all with the same face in the photograph. "3 names," I said. "Edward Carraway, Alan Duport, and Frederick Meeks." "And likely more," Holmes replied. "Enough for a man to vanish and be reborn whenever his previous shell grows too tight." He reached for a small velvet pouch from the back shelf and opened it. Inside was a ring, plain, save for a crest etched on the underside. "A signet," Holmes said, inspecting it. "We must be cautious now. I suspect we are not merely confronting a charlatan, but a man with ties to something far more organized and far more dangerous." Just then we heard the sound of the front door opening, quiet but unmistakable. Carraway had returned. Holmes shut the pantry door softly. "Come, Watson," he whispered. "Let us see what mask he wears tonight." Holmes extinguished his lantern with a flick of his wrist just as the front door clicked shut with the subtle finality of a man accustomed to silence. We remained still in the kitchen's gloom. The pantry door closed behind us once more, the peculiar scent of wax and chemical tinctures lingering faintly in the air. Holmes gestured for me to follow and moved like a shadow through the hallway. We paused just outside the drawing-room where Mrs. Carraway sat by the fire, her posture tense. I could hear the soft rustle of gloves being removed and the creak of polished shoes upon hardwood as Edward Carraway, or whatever his true name, entered the front hall. He did not call out. Instead, we heard the faint clink of something set down, perhaps a key, perhaps a glass. Then silence. Holmes's eyes narrowed, and he touched his finger to his lips. "Sims," came the voice from the hallway. Calm, deceptively so. "Yes, sir," the servant answered from somewhere nearby, perhaps the shadows of the stairs. "Prepare my study." "I'll be there within the quarter." Footsteps receded down the corridor. Holmes turned to me. "We must reach that study before he does." Quickly we crept along the wall, avoiding the broad floorboards that might betray us with a groan. The study door stood at the end of the hall. Holmes examined the lock, produced a second key from his inner coat, and had the door open within seconds. The room was dim, lit only by the dying glow of a fireplace's embers. Shelves of ledgers and ledgers of shelves surrounded a massive oak desk. The windows were shuttered tight, and a decanter of brandy sat untouched beside a crystal glass. It was, on the surface, an ordinary gentleman's study, but Holmes's eyes flicked immediately toward the bookcase nearest the desk. He stepped forward and reached behind the shelf, fingers tapping. Then, with a quick motion, He slid a false panel aside, revealing a hollow section inside the wall. Tucked within were several slim, leather-bound volumes. "Medical reports," he murmured. "Look here." I stepped closer. Holmes opened the top volume. Inside were detailed sketches, anatomical, though not human, skeletal, variations, muscle structures, some bordering on the grotesque. The language was not in English, Latin mostly, interspersed with what I guessed to be a cipher. On the inside cover was stamped an insignia, a serpent coiled around a mask, beneath which were etched the letters COMM. "Watson," Holmes said quietly, "do you recall the case of the Mortimer forgeries? The affair with the theatrically trained hypnotist in Brussels?" Vaguely. There were whispers then of an organization. Secretive, transient, men and women who specialized in assuming identities not for profit but for infiltration into families, governments, institutions. This, he tapped the symbol, may be the same circle. The circle of masked men. I've encountered the initials before, though never this clearly connected. He pulled another folder free. Inside was a photograph, sepia-toned, slightly cracked. A woman in a wedding gown holding a bouquet of dark lilies. Her face was obscured by a veil. Holmes compared it to the mask we had found in the pantry. Same jawline, same chin. The mask may be a likeness of this woman, or of someone meant to become her, or replace her. There came a knock, not on the door, but from somewhere within the room. Holmes froze. We listened. A second knock, hollow, metallic. He turned his head toward the fireplace. "Behind the hearth," he whispered. "There's something concealed." He stepped forward, examined the base, and with a swift motion pushed aside a section of the iron grate. Beneath it was a latch. He pulled it. The fireplace stones groaned, and a section of the rear wall lifted just slightly, revealing a cramped chamber barely large enough for a man to crawl into. Holmes leaned in, holding the lantern aloft. Inside was a box. He drew it out, black lacquer, no lock, no label. He opened it. Inside were two folded veils, one white lace, one black silk, precisely like the ones Mrs. Carroway wore. Beneath them, a series of envelopes. Holmes opened one. Inside was a newspaper clipping. "Heiress disappears on eve of wedding. Lydia Glass, daughter of steel magnate, vanishes from estate in Surrey." Another envelope held a lock of auburn hair tied with twine. Holmes exhaled slowly. "This isn't disguise. It's replacement, erasure." I stared at the article, then at the veils. "Do you believe that Alice Carroway was not meant to survive her own wedding?" Holmes's expression turned grim. "Or worse, she was meant to become someone else." A sudden noise stopped us, footsteps, rapid, coming down the hall. Holmes replaced the items and sealed the fireplace just as the door handle turned. Sims stepped in, his face impassive. "The master requests your presence," he said evenly. Holmes brushed soot from his sleeves. We were admiring his library. Sims's eyes did not move from Holmes. "He asks that you come now." We followed him back to the drawing room. Edward Carroway stood by the mantel, his face lit by the orange glow of firelight. In his hand was a silver-tipped cane he had not carried earlier. "I trust you found my pantry instructive," he said, glancing at Holmes. "And my study, though I suspect the more esoteric corners escaped your notice." Holmes said nothing. His face betrayed no alarm. Carroway smiled, a tight expression devoid of warmth. "You see, gentlemen, I've dealt with inquisitive minds before, in Trieste, in Prague, and once, regrettably, in Alexandria. They ask questions, they prod, and eventually they vanish." Mrs. Carroway stood behind him, visibly shaken. "But I am not without hospitality," he continued. I propose a toast. He reached for the decanter of brandy, poured 3 glasses. Holmes stepped forward. Before we drink, he said, a question. Carraway raised an eyebrow. Why 2 veils? Holmes asked. Why not 1? Why that specific affectation? Carraway swirled his glass. Symbolism, Mr. Holmes. The first veil to shield the bride from scrutiny, the second to remind her that truth is layered, that one must peel away much to see clearly. Or perhaps it is merely a flair for the dramatic. He raised his glass. To mystery? Holmes did not drink. Instead, he studied the flame in the hearth. A theatrical man, he murmured, and yet not an actor. He turned to Carraway. I'll accept your toast, sir. But know this, curtains, no matter how heavy, cannot keep the daylight out forever. Some truths do not burn, they drank in silence, and the fire crackled on, throwing shifting shadows across a room where nothing, least of all identities, could be trusted. The next morning broke cold and colourless, with a pale sun struggling to penetrate the thick London mist. We had returned to Baker Street before dawn, Holmes having made the decision, shortly after the tense toast in Carraway's drawing room, that our investigations must now proceed from a safer vantage. He had, in his words, smiled politely at the lion and backed from its den. Mrs. Carraway remained in the Richmond house under our instruction, but not without Holmes, leaving her a small slip of paper bearing specific steps should her husband attempt any sudden departure, or if she were to find herself locked in. She had nodded with grave understanding, slipping the note into her stocking. Now I watched as Holmes stood in front of the fire in our sitting room, the morning edition of the Times open in one hand, a telegraph form in the other. He read both simultaneously, his eyes flicking between them with the precision of a clockmaker aligning gears. "Well, Watson," he said at last, folding the paper and tucking it under his arm, "we are not chasing a lunatic or a scoundrel. We are dealing with a man trained in the art of social disappearance." He handed me the article from the newspaper, an item buried on page 8 under Foreign Reports. Police in Lubeck seek British consul's assistant in connection with forged passports. The man, believed to be travelling under various aliases, is connected to at least 4 fraudulent identity schemes across Northern Europe. Descriptions vary, though officials agree on one constant: a serpent-shaped burn on his right wrist. I looked up. Carraway? Holmes nodded. Or Meeks, or Duport, or whatever name he wore in Lubeck. But yes, the burn matches. You saw him remove his gloves briefly before the toast and the circle of masked men? I asked. Is this their work? Holmes pressed his fingertips together, pacing. If they are what I suspect, a network of impersonators for hire, then yes. But I now believe Carraway is not merely a client of this group. He is a craftsman within it. One of their architects. I sat forward. Then what of Lydia Glass, the woman on the second marriage certificate? Has he replaced her? Not yet, Holmes said, but he tried. And it failed. He walked to the table and unfolded the 2 marriage certificates, Mrs. Alice Carraway's, and the older one naming Lydia Glass. Then he placed between them the photograph we'd found in the study, the bride in lace and lilies, her face concealed by the veil. Note the handwriting, Holmes said. Both certificates were filled by the same registrar, or so it appears. But on closer inspection, he pointed with a long finger. The loop on the G in Glass is inconsistent, forged, sloppily too. I believe the Lydia Glass certificate was falsified to create a paper trail. But why? To establish legitimacy before the impersonation was complete. I was still puzzling over that when a knock interrupted us. Mrs. Hudson entered, bearing a card on a small silver tray. Holmes took it and read aloud. Mr. Victor Eltringham, a solicitor. He raised an eyebrow. "Show him in." A tall man entered, lean and angular, with a nose that belonged more to a vulture than a lawyer. His frock coat was immaculate, and he carried a briefcase clasped tight against his chest, like a reliquary. "Mr. Holmes," he said, bowing stiffly. "And Dr. Watson, I come representing the interests of a Miss Lydia Glass, or rather, her surviving kin go on," Holmes said. "I have been tasked with locating any documents or testimonies relating to Miss Glass's sudden disappearance this past June. You may have read about it. She vanished the night before her wedding. A matter of some public embarrassment, as her father is the industrialist Edwin Glass." "I recall," Holmes said. "The papers whispered of scandal." "There was more than scandal," Eltringham said. "There was silence. No body, no ransom, no sightings. The father has quietly employed investigators in Berlin, Paris, even Trieste. All failed. Then last week someone, an anonymous hand, mailed him this." He opened his briefcase and removed a single object. A torn piece of veil wrapped around a playing card. Holmes took it, examining both sides. "The Queen of Hearts," he murmured. "Symbolic." The handwriting on the veil's wrapper, Eltringham continued, bore a simple phrase, "She wore two." We traced the phrase back to a small theatrical review written 6 years ago in Antwerp. A production called The Bride Who Wore Two Veils. We found the author, one Edward Carraway, and you suspect this name is false? "We suspect everything," Eltringham said. "That is why we've come to you." Holmes handed the card back. "You were wise to do so. Mr. Carraway, if that is his name, is currently playing husband to a second woman, Alice Carraway." "Then he's escalated," the solicitor said darkly. "What was once an art of forging papers has become marital substitution." Holmes turned to me. "Watson, make preparations." We returned to Richmond at once, but not as ourselves. I blinked. "Disguises?" Holmes nodded. "I believe our man's next move is imminent, and I wish to meet him as someone he will trust." 2 hours later, we approached the Richmond house under grey skies and colder air. Holmes had transformed himself entirely, his angular features rounded by padding, his sharp eyes dulled by spectacles, his speech now marred by an Austrian accent so convincing even I had to double-take. He was, he explained, a medical examiner from the continent, newly arrived to inspect matters of delicate foreign concern. I accompanied him as his assistant. Sims opened the door, his face unreadable. "We are expected," Holmes said, handing over a letter embossed with the seal of the Royal Austrian Embassy. False, naturally, but masterfully rendered. Sims took the letter without a word and gestured us inside. We were shown into the drawing-room, where Carraway awaited, dressed again in his gentleman's best, but his eyes darker than before. He studied us as one might inspect a foreign coin, careful but curious. "You are the man from the embassy," he said to Holmes. "Ja, Dr. Vogel, and this is Herr Stein," Holmes said with a bow. "We come at request from Lübeck, a matter of identity verification. I am sure you understand the sensitivity." Carraway's expression flickered. Just once. He nodded slowly. "Of course." "But I must ask, why now?" Holmes smiled. "Because your name is not the only one on Z list." Carraway's fingers tightened around the back of his chair. "And if I refuse?" Holmes leaned closer. "Then your circle will tighten, Herr Carraway, until you are no longer on Z outside of it, but in the center. Alone." A long silence followed. Then Carraway stepped back and nodded. "Very well, Doctor. But I assure you, you will find only what I allow you to find." Holmes inclined his head. "Then let us begin." I caught his eye. Beneath the foreign accent and the round glasses, the gleam of pursuit had returned. The mask was slipping, and Holmes was ready to catch what lay beneath. The house at Richmond had grown darker since our last visit. Though the hour was only 3:30, the fog pressed tightly to the windows, and the gaslight flickered as if uncertain of its own authority. The fire in the drawing-room crackled low, casting shadows across the oriental rug like ink stains seeping into silk. Holmes, disguised still as the bespectacled Dr. Vogel, stood facing Edward Carraway with studied patience, his posture deferential, but not weak. I sat beside a small writing desk, scribbling notes in German, as we had agreed beforehand. Neither of us yet knew how far Carraway's linguistic talents extended, but Holmes had insisted we risk no unnecessary English unless provoked. "You understand?" Holmes said, slipping deeper into his accent. "The verification process is not one of suspicion, but of compliance. Lübeck's ministry has their own reasons, but your assistance will be, how you say, seen favourably." Carraway gave a tight-lipped smile. "Of course. I'm always eager to oblige our European allies. What is it you require?" Holmes produced a folded list from his inner pocket. Simple items: records of employment, documents of entry, passports, manifests, customs slips, and any photographic material from before the year 1890. Carraway accepted the list and glanced over it with a faint trace of amusement. "Photographs from before 90? That's nearly impossible. I hardly had the foresight to be born with a camera at hand." Holmes did not respond. Instead, he walked to the fireplace and began studying the items on the mantel: a small brass clock, 2 miniature portraits, a half-melted red candle in an ivory holder. Carraway watched him, his fingers interlaced behind his back. "You seem very interested in decor, Doctor." "Objects speak," Holmes murmured, tilting the candle gently. "More often than their owners suspect." He turned to me and gestured. I rose, opened my satchel, and withdrew the forged inspection seal, bearing the Austrian emblem. Holmes took it and stamped the list on the mantel. "They will begin with your private rooms," he said. "They are not included in official registries, and as such require personal confirmation." Carraway paused. "That's quite the liberty." Holmes returned his gaze evenly. "It is a requirement. Or do you refuse to comply?" After a pause, long enough to weigh the implications, Carraway nodded. "Sims will accompany you," he said. "He knows the house." Holmes bowed. "That will not be necessary." And with that, he turned on his heel and exited the drawing-room, leaving Carraway and I to follow. We ascended the staircase slowly, the plush runner muffling our steps. Carraway led us past the guest chambers and opened a narrow door near the end of the hall. "My study," he said. "I presume this is the sort of room you intend to inspect." Holmes walked in silently. The room was just as we had left it during our prior clandestine search, though now the fireplace bore fresh ashes. Holmes examined the grate, crouching slightly, and removed a poker to stir the soot. "Recently used," he remarked. "Did you destroy papers?" "A few," Carraway said. "Personal correspondence. I am a man of discretion." Holmes pulled a fragment of blackened parchment from the ashes. He examined it, lips twitching in mild satisfaction, then dropped it back in. "And this?" He moved to a side table and picked up a small ceramic bust. It was of a woman, serene, expressionless, with a veil carved over her eyes. Carraway gave a brief chuckle. "A wedding gift. From a rather eccentric friend. He claimed it would bring layers of clarity. Personally, I find it rather ominous." Holmes turned it over. At its base, an engraving. "To the bride who wore 2 veils, COMM." I stepped forward instinctively, but Holmes raised a hand behind his back, a subtle warning. "Not yet." Instead, Holmes murmured, "You will pardon my caution. This house has unusual furnishings." Carraway narrowed his eyes. "As does your manner, Doctor." Holmes smiled, slow and deliberate. "Only in service of clarity." We moved next to the master bedroom. The bed was meticulously made, no sign of intimacy, no trace of shared habitation. A man's room in function and appearance, but one missing all sense of personality. "This is where your wife sleeps?" Holmes asked. Carraway's tone turned cooler. "She has her own room." He gestured toward a door at the far end of the corridor. We crossed into it, and at once I felt the change in atmosphere. The air was colder, the curtains were drawn tightly, and the oil lamp on the table flickered feebly. Holmes walked to the vanity and picked up a small music box. He wound it, and a lilting, almost melancholic melody filled the room. It sounded familiar, though I could not place it. Some Viennese lullaby, perhaps. Holmes seemed to recognize it instantly. "Schlaf, Kindchen, schlaf," he murmured. A child's cradle song. Odd for a bridal suite, Carraway's face betrayed nothing. Holmes turned again to the windows. He pulled back the drapes, nailed shut. Behind the glass, only fog. But on the sill, visible even from a few feet away, lay several deep gouges, scratches as if made by fingernails. Holmes said nothing. Instead, he looked down and retrieved a small piece of torn fabric wedged between the boards. He passed it silently to me. It was a shred of black silk veil. Carraway cleared his throat. "If you've finished cataloguing my linens, Doctor, I believe we've completed the necessary inspection." Holmes straightened and walked slowly to the door. "Indeed. The house has spoken." We left without a word, Carraway escorting us back to the front hall. Sims watched from the shadows, expression unreadable, as ever. As we exited into the thickening mist, I leaned toward Holmes and murmured, "That veil fragment, it matches the second veil Mrs. Carraway wears." Holmes nodded. "And the scratches on the sill?" I added. "She tried to escape," he said. "Once." We reached the gate, and Holmes stopped, scanning the fog. "We must return tonight," he said, pulling off his spectacles. "Without masks." I blinked. "Tonight? What for?" "For the truth," he said grimly. "The house is not merely a stage, it is a trap, and I believe Carraway's next act is already rehearsed." A silence fell between us, broken only by the sound of hoofbeats in the distance and the creaking of a gas lamp. Holmes turned to me once more. "Watson," he said, "do not sleep this night." I believe the final performance has begun. The fog that blanketed Richmond that night seemed almost designed to conceal secrets. It drifted across the hedgerows like gauze drawn over a corpse, muffling every footfall and deadening the clatter of distant hooves. Holmes and I had returned under cover of dusk, not in disguise this time, but as ourselves. Holmes with his coat collar high, I with my revolver tucked discreetly beneath my greatcoat. He had insisted upon it. "No more veils, Watson," he had said earlier in the day. "Tonight we remove them, metaphorically and perhaps literally. The house on Upper Mill Lane holds more than deception. It may yet hold a grave." We approached on foot, the gate squeaking softly as Holmes pushed it open. No light shone from the front windows. The house was cloaked in shadow, its silhouette sharp against the fog-lit sky. Holmes raised a finger to his lips and gestured for me to follow around the side of the property. At the rear of the house, beneath the overgrown conservatory, he stopped and knelt, examining the ground. His lantern, shielded by a thick hood, cast only the faintest beam. "Bootprints," he murmured, "heavy, recent, from this evening. 2 sets, Carraway and Sims, I'd wager." The prints led toward the cellar doors, thick oak slats chained shut with a rusted padlock. Holmes produced a key he had acquired during our previous inspection. The pantry was locked with its twin, he said quietly. Our Mr. Carroway is nothing if not orderly. The lock yielded with a reluctant snap, and Holmes eased the doors open with barely a creak. A sour, earthy smell drifted up, mould and something fainter, more chemical. We descended the stone steps in silence. The cellar was low-ceilinged and lined with crates. Holmes raised the lantern slightly, revealing jars sealed with wax, cloth-covered bottles, and wooden trunks bearing foreign stamps. Hamburg, Calais, Brussels. He moved to one of the crates, pried it open with a thin iron bar, and drew back. Inside were garments, dresses, gowns, shoes wrapped in tissue. All women's attire. Each piece labelled with a tag, some handwritten, others typed on brittle cardstock. Holmes pulled one free and held it to the lantern light. The card read, Marguerite L. Trieste. October 1893. He checked another, Thérèse H. Liège, July 1894. These are not costumes, Holmes said grimly. They are identities. Discarded like snakeskins, I swallowed hard. What became of the women? Holmes shook his head. Some may have escaped. Others? He trailed off, his gaze moving to a trunk in the far corner. Larger, heavier. It bore no label. Holmes opened it. Inside were books, diaries, letters, and one tattered wedding veil, stiff with age and stained brown in places. Holmes lifted a small book and handed it to me. It was written in a woman's hand, neat and fluent. June 3rd. He calls himself Edward now. He speaks of Antwerp, of a house we'll share near the coast. But I know none of it is true. He watches me too closely. Even my dreams feel borrowed. I turned the page. The final entry read, I wore both veils this morning as he asked. He said I would soon forget my former name, but I will not. I am Thérèse, I am Thérèse, I am Thérèse. Holmes read over my shoulder. His mouth tightened. It is a ritual, Watson. Each woman is stripped of her name, then redraped in anonymity. The veils are not symbols, they're instruments. A sudden noise above, a creak, faint but deliberate. Someone had crossed the floorboards of the room directly overhead. Holmes extinguished the lantern. We stood in the dark, listening. The sound came again, footsteps, slow, heavy, then a softer tread behind. Two figures, moving toward the stairs. Holmes motioned me back into the shadows behind a stack of crates. The cellar door opened. A wedge of faint light spilled down the stone steps, and then a shape appeared, tall, angular. Carroway. He descended with a lamp in one hand, the other clasped behind his back. Behind him, Sims followed silently, carrying something wrapped in cloth. They passed within feet of us, unaware. Carroway stopped near the crates we'd opened. His voice was low, but clear in the stillness. Thérèse, Marguerite, Lydia, Alice. They all flinched, you know, in the end, even the ones who pretended otherwise. He unwrapped the cloth Sims had carried. Inside was another mask, like the one Holmes had shown me in the pantry, but newly made. Its features were finer and disturbingly familiar. It was the face of Alice Carroway. Sims said nothing. He moved to the large trunk and began clearing a space nearby, setting down a folded wooden contraption, something between a chair and a frame. Carroway caressed the mask with a kind of reverence. This one? She has lasted longer. Her mind resisted. I thought for a time she might succeed in rewriting me. He chuckled softly. But the past always wins. And the face always fits. He placed the mask atop the frame like a crown on a throne. Holmes's hand gripped my sleeve. He leaned close to my ear. We must act now. If she's not already sedated, she will be soon. But how? I whispered. There's no exit without crossing them. Holmes's eyes gleamed in the dark. We use the mask, he said. In a flash, Holmes reached into his satchel, producing the old mask from the pantry, and hurled it with precision across the room. It struck the far wall with a hollow crack and skidded behind crates. The effect was immediate. Carraway turned, startled. "Who's there?" Holmes stepped into the light. "Sherlock Holmes," he said calmly. "I believe you've lost your audience." Carraway froze. Sims reached for something inside his coat, but I was already moving. I tackled Sims to the ground, sending his lantern crashing to the floor where it shattered, plunging the room into flickering darkness. Holmes and Carraway grappled beside the crates, their shadows twisting grotesquely across the wall. Carraway was stronger than I had expected, and for a moment it seemed Holmes might be overpowered. But then Holmes feinted, twisted, and struck Carraway's temple with the butt of his lantern. The man crumpled without a sound. Sims, pinned beneath me, made no further struggle. We lit a fresh lantern. Holmes knelt beside Carraway and turned over his wrist. There, raw and unmistakable, was the serpent-shaped burn. "This," Holmes said, "is the last veil." Carraway, if that was truly his name, lay unconscious against the stone floor, one arm sprawled across the overturned crate, the other bent unnaturally beneath him. Holmes stood over him, breath shallow, eyes narrowed, not with triumph, but with an expression I had come to associate with grim confirmation. Beside me, Sims knelt in silence, his hands bound behind his back, with a strip of cloth torn from the very veil we'd found in the trunk. The man had offered no protest after the scuffle, only a vacant, almost tranquil resignation, as though the collapse of his master was something he had long anticipated. Holmes pressed his hand to Carraway's throat briefly. "He lives." Barely stunned, he rose and turned to me. "Watson, search that side of the cellar. Look for an interior door, a false wall, a hidden passage, anything that might suggest a room within the foundation. I do not believe we have yet found everything." "What makes you say so?" Holmes pointed to the mask, the new one, still perched atop the wooden contraption like a ghastly sculpture awaiting its subject. "This was meant to be used tonight. And it requires more than an empty cellar. Somewhere in this house is a chamber designed not only for observation, but transformation." He turned sharply to Sims. "Where is she?" Sims looked up. His voice, when it came, was dry and faint. "Behind the mirror." Holmes frowned. "Which mirror?" "In the chamber." The one with the lace curtains. Holmes's gaze snapped toward me. "The bridal suite." He turned without another word and ascended the steps in haste. I followed, my revolver drawn, Sims left behind, tethered to a support beam. We crossed the back lawn under misted moonlight, re-entered through the kitchen, and moved swiftly through the shadowed halls. The house felt different now, emptied of performance, devoid of the theatrical menace Carraway had maintained like a careful stage manager. We reached the upstairs hall. Holmes entered the bridal room first, sweeping his lantern in a slow arc. Everything was exactly as we had left it, except for one detail. The mirror above the vanity table now bore a streak, as if a hand had brushed its surface recently. Holmes crossed the room, inspecting the mirror's frame with intense scrutiny. He tapped along the edges, listening for hollows, then stopped and removed the mirror entirely from its mount. Behind it was a wooden panel, a faint groove traced along its bottom, almost invisible beneath the grain. Holmes reached for a hairpin resting on the vanity and slid it into the groove. With a soft click, the panel shifted. Behind it, a narrow door. "Watson," he said, "light the lantern." I did so, and the golden glow fell upon a corridor just wide enough for one person to pass through. It descended in a spiral, stone steps dry and cold. Holmes stepped through without hesitation. The passage twisted downward for what seemed an unnaturally long time until it opened into a chamber far beneath the house, a sub-cellar of sorts built into the very earth. The air was cool and sharp with the faint scent of lavender and formalin. It was utterly silent. At the far end of the chamber, beneath a single hanging lamp, was a bed, small, white-sheeted and too clean. On it sat a woman. She was dressed in a gown of pale silk, hands folded neatly in her lap. Her eyes were open, wide, glassy, but not vacant. She blinked slowly as the light reached her, and for a moment I thought she might be drugged. Holmes approached carefully. "Mrs. Carroway?" She blinked again, and then, in a voice small and flat, "Which one?" Holmes halted. "Pardon?" She turned her head slightly. "Which name should I use?" There have been so many. He said I must choose the one that fit the veil. Holmes lowered the lantern. "You are Alice?" he said. "Alice Carroway. You came to me for help. Do you remember?" Her eyes flickered. "I remember a church, a red ribbon. My gloves were too tight." She paused. "And a room with no windows. The other girls called me Therese, but I said no." Holmes knelt beside her, carefully examining her pupils. "She's been kept here," he said to me, "and likely under the influence of laudanum or a similar sedative, long enough to blur memory, but not erase it. The room was lined with shelves, rows of small objects, hair combs, veils, shoes, all feminine, each with a label." Holmes walked to the shelf nearest the bed. He picked up a notebook, bound in cream leather, the initials AC embossed in gold. He opened it. Inside were journal entries, some written in a delicate hand, others shaky, uncertain. "He calls me Lydia today." I said I did not care for the name. He said I would learn to. I wrote Alice over and over, but he tore the page out. There was another girl. She cried at night. She isn't here anymore. Holmes turned a page and held it up to the lantern. "He made me wear the second veil today, said the transformation is nearly complete. I do not wish to be someone else. I am Alice. I am Alice. I am—" The sentence trailed off in ink. Behind us, Alice stirred again. "Is he dead?" "No," Holmes said, "but he will be." She nodded slowly, then added, "You should burn the masks." Holmes studied her for a moment. "Why?" "Because if you don't, someone else will wear them." We said nothing for a long time. Then Holmes rose and turned to me. "Watson, stay with her. I must fetch the inspector." He reached the top of the stone stairs, then paused. "Bring the veil," he said over his shoulder. I followed his gaze to the corner of the room. There, draped over a mannequin, was the final veil, the black silk one, untouched, unworn. And yet, ready, subterranean chamber clung to his shoulders even as he emerged into the bridal room once more. It was as though the walls had absorbed the sorrow and confusion of that hidden cell beneath the house, exhaling it now into the soft stillness of the upper hall. Below, Watson remained with Alice, if that was yet her name, watching over her as she drifted between lucidity and confusion. Holmes had left behind a small flask of cordial to calm her nerves, but no cordial could mend the fractures in memory deliberately scribed by weeks, perhaps months, of suggestion and erasure. Holmes crossed the corridor to the master bedroom, stepping inside the cold chamber where Edward Carroway had kept up his charade. The room was too precise, each surface dustless, each item of clothing hanging with military symmetry. It was the cell of a man who performed identity as one dons armor. On the bedside table, Holmes noticed something he had previously overlooked, a stack of index cards bound by a crimson ribbon. Each card bore a name in crisp script. Some he recognized from the veils and garments in the cellar: Therese, Marguerite, Lydia. And at the bottom of the stack, faint and smudged, Alice. Holmes undid the ribbon and rifled through the cards. On the back of each, notes in a fine, slanted hand. Therese responds to music, prefers violets. Marguerite asked for a priest. Removed access to religious objects. Lydia shows defiance. Transition took 16 days. No card bore evidence of care or regret, only experimentation. And then Holmes found a final card, this one blank on the front, but containing a single phrase on the reverse. The next must not remember. He turned to the fireplace. A soft draught whispered through the flue. On the mantel sat a small brass matchbox, engraved with a coiled serpent. Holmes took it, pocketed the ribboned cards, and stepped back into the hallway. Downstairs, the house remained silent. The cellar door was still ajar. Holmes descended, boots echoing on the stone, and found Sims where they had left him, bound, seated, but watching the shadows with alert and unblinking eyes. Holmes crouched. "I ask you one final time," he said quietly. "What is COMM?" Sims stared at him. "I don't know what it stands for." Holmes raised an eyebrow. "But you know what it is." A pause, then a nod. "A circle," Sims said, his voice hoarse. "A guild. Not many members, each trained to erase and rewrite identity. They seek women who can be made to vanish without notice, those without strong kin or fortune, and sometimes those with both, if the price is right." He leaned forward slightly. "Your Mr. Carraway wasn't always the artist. Once, he was a project. Then he became the master. The masks were his innovation." Holmes exhaled slowly. "And you, what were you?" "I was the mirror," Sims said, "the one who told them who they had been until they believed it." Holmes stood. "Then consider this your final reflection. Scotland Yard will arrive within the hour." He turned and strode up the stairs. Outside, the fog had thinned just enough for Holmes to make out the yellow lamps of a constable's carriage rounding the bend. Inspector Lestrade emerged from the mist, coat flapping, moustache already bristling with displeasure. "I hope you haven't dragged me out for another missing canary," he grumbled. "You're about to find a house of ghosts," Holmes said flatly. "And the man who wears them?" Lestrade followed him inside, boots stamping warmth back into numb feet. "Ghosts, is it?" he said. "We'll see." Holmes led him first to the drawing-room, where Edward Carraway now lay bound in one of his own parlour chairs, head lolled to the side, features slack. A small trickle of dried blood curled behind his left ear. Lestrade looked him over. "This him?" Holmes nodded. "You'll find his identification in the desk. Under several aliases, but you won't find any that are true." Lestrade frowned. "What's he done?" Holmes paused. "There is no one crime to name. What he's done is an accumulation of stolen lives. He's erased women, rebuilt them as fiction, and in doing so, he's written himself into places he never belonged." Lestrade stared. "You're saying he's a bigamist? A forger?" "I'm saying," Holmes replied, "that he's a thief of identity, and the crimes he's committed, abduction, coercion, psychological manipulation, will require a magistrate's imagination just to classify." Lestrade turned away, disturbed. "Where are the victims?" Holmes motioned upstairs. "One remains." They climbed in silence. Lestrade entered the bridal room with slow steps, then turned pale as Holmes opened the secret panel behind the mirror and led him into the passage. At the bottom, Alice sat as she had before, quiet, composed, veil folded neatly in her lap. Lestrade stood, frozen, unsure whether to speak to her or simply apologize to the air. Holmes bent beside her. "We're taking you away from here," he said gently. "To a hospital, at first." There will be doctors and gentle light and no masks. Alice gave a small nod. Her voice was a whisper. May I choose my name again? Yes, Holmes replied. And this time, no one will take it from you. Later that night, as the house emptied of its shadows, Holmes and I stood outside beneath the branches of a leafless elm. The police had removed Carraway and Sims. The remaining rooms would be combed by forensics. But Holmes had already seen all he needed. He drew from his coat the bundle of index cards and cast them into a small iron brazier brought from the kitchen. One by one the names curled into flame, Therese, Marguerite, Lydia, until only Alice remained. Holmes hesitated. Then he tore the card clean in half and dropped the pieces into the fire. She need not be defined by what they made her, he said. She may begin again. I nodded. But Holmes, I said slowly, what if there are others? Other houses, other Vales? He looked into the flames, and the flickering light dancing in his sharp grey eyes. There are always others, Watson. But now we know what the circle looks like, and how it closes. 3 days had passed since the veil had lifted from the house on Upper Mill Lane. Scotland Yard had cordoned off the residence, and the newspapers, smelling blood in the water, had begun to stir. Yet oddly, there were no lurid headlines, no sensational tales of captive brides or identity theft. Only a passing notice in the Evening Standard had mentioned the arrest of a foreign impostor under suspicion of fraud. The rest, at Holmes's request, was kept out of print. This case, he said to me, one afternoon in our sitting room, as he pored over a stack of sealed envelopes, is like a fine embroidery, its pattern concealed until held against the light. Pull the wrong thread, and the whole image unravels into madness. That is what we have preserved. He meant Alice, of course. She now rested at a private sanatorium in the countryside under the care of a doctor Holmes trusted implicitly. According to the latest letter, her condition was improving. The veil had not only been removed from her head, but from her mind. Slowly, patiently, she had begun to remember her own name, not one chosen for her, not one handed to her with a new gown and a fresh voice, but her name. Alice Langford. She had not been married legally. The ceremony with Edward Carraway had been a performance, staged with forged papers and a bribed officiant. No true marriage, no trace in the official registry. Holmes had said it was both a blessing and a curse, tragedy. Freedom comes more easily when no one claims you, he had remarked, but so too does disappearance. Now, as I stood by the fireplace, warming my hands against the autumn chill, Holmes spread before him on the table the remnants of the only real clue that remained unresolved, the card with the COMM insignia and the wax seal with the coiled serpent. We've destroyed the masks, Watson, he said, but the face that designed them still watches. I frowned. Carraway was the architect, you said. He was a craftsman, possibly even the originator of the ritual, but the organization that shaped him, that trained him, protected him, supplied him with fresh identities, they are still active. He tapped a finger against the wax seal. The serpent eats its tail, Watson. This is not over. A knock came at the door. Mrs. Hudson stepped in, holding a telegram on a silver tray. Holmes took it, read it swiftly, and handed it to me. From Inspector Lestrade, Scotland Yard. Suspect Sims taken ill in custody. Claimed to have seen the other faces. Muttered of a second mask in fireplace ashes. Died this morning. Unconfirmed toxicology. Send advice. Holmes's face had hardened. The other faces, he repeated. Plural. I stepped back. You think he meant actual masks? No, Holmes murmured, already rising. I think he meant accomplices. Hidden identities. Another circle. Sims was a pawn, Watson, but even pawns know the colour of the opposing king. We were out the door and in a cab within 10 minutes, heading straight to Scotland Yard. Lestrade met us in his office, jaw tight and eyes bleary. The room smelled of burnt tobacco and rain. "I don't like this one, Holmes," he said without preamble. Sims had no sign of prior illness, no trace of foul play in the cell. But the coroner found signs of something strange, a compound not yet identified but consistent with certain imported neurotoxins. Ones used in the East, very rare. Administered how? Holmes asked. That's just it, we don't know. No wounds, no injection sites, no broken skin. If it was taken by mouth, he did so without notice. Holmes nodded slowly. Which means it was planned, likely carried in on his person. A last resort, a final loyalty. Lestrade dropped a small evidence bag on the table. We found this in the ash of Carraway's fireplace, as Sims claimed. Inside was a charred scrap of linen, curled and brittle. Holmes held it up with forceps. The burn had eaten away most of the fabric, but a corner remained. Embroidered into the edge, barely visible, was a sigil, not the serpent, but something new. A needle crossed over a flame. Holmes's eyes narrowed. Not the circle of masked men, something adjacent, or perhaps a branch. Lestrade groaned. How many circles are there? As many as the masks they wear, Holmes said softly. And we've only peeled away the first. He turned to me. We must return to Richmond. To the house? I asked. It's still under constable guard. No, he replied. To what lies beneath it. The first circle was not the cellar, Watson, it was the stage, the dressing room. But the theatre, where the audience never sees, may be below even that. We arrived at the Richmond property under cover of dusk once more. The constables recognized us and granted entry. Holmes carried with him a black satchel filled with tools, small chisels, brushes, and a vial of quicksilver for detecting tampered surfaces. He led us not to the cellar, but to the adjacent garden, an overgrown square with ivy-choked statues and one crumbling sundial. Holmes circled the sundial twice, then knelt beside its base. "Watson," he said quietly, "help me lift this." We heaved the stone aside. Beneath was a hatch, iron, pitted with age, but intact. Holmes used a thin blade to break the rusted seal, and we descended again, this time into deeper cold. It was not a cellar, it was a vault. The walls were lined with boxes, dozens of them, each the size of a hat case, numbered in a scrawled, slanted script. Holmes opened one. Inside, a sealed envelope, a vial of perfume, and a marriage license for a woman named Elena Mireille, married in Toulon in 1891. Another box contained an Italian passport, a lock of hair, and a faded photograph. "They are not trophies," Holmes whispered. "They are archives." I stared. "Of what?" He looked at me. "Of the women who were meant to become others." Holmes stepped back, surveying the room with an expression I had seen only once before, during the Milverton affair when we had entered the blackmailer's vault. He reached for a fresh envelope and slid it open. Inside was a card. "Your new life begins when the second veil is lifted." COMM. He pocketed the card and turned toward the stairs. "This place will be burned, Watson, and salted. But before that we will take every record, every name, every clue." He paused on the first step. "We haven't closed the circle yet." I followed him back into the dusk, the vault behind us whispering secrets in the language of silk and ash. The rain fell that night in long, silent veils, masking the streets of London with the hush of a city holding its breath. Inside our Baker Street lodgings, the hearth glowed softly, throwing its flickering light across Holmes's cluttered desk. Stacks of papers, labelled envelopes, and photographs of forgotten brides lay in loose formations, like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle too chilling to frame. Holmes sat with his violin across his lap, not to play, but merely to rest his fingers against its neck, as though the weight of the instrument grounded him while his mind surged elsewhere. The Richmond vault had been cleared. With Lestrade's reluctant approval, Holmes had arranged for every box to be delivered to our rooms under lock and escort. The secrecy had been total. The operation swift. For now, Scotland Yard had agreed to keep all findings internal until the full extent of the network could be exposed. I stood by the window, watching the lanterns flicker through the fog beyond. "It feels," I said quietly, "as though we've found the skeleton, but not the soul." Holmes looked up. "A keen observation, Watson. What we unearthed beneath that house was the mechanism, the machinery of deception, but not the author of it." He gestured toward the array of documents spread across the table. These boxes contained traces of 23 women, at least 16 assumed new names, at least 7 vanished without record, but in only 3 cases does the name Edward Carraway appear. He leaned forward, selecting one of the files, Lydia Glass. The marriage certificate, the veil, the torn photograph. We had reconstructed her file entirely. Lydia was one of his early subjects. He failed to complete the transition, too much resistance perhaps. But someone wanted her assimilated anyway. Her name appears again in letters found in the French archives. She was being traced, but not by her family. I furrowed my brow. "Then who?" Holmes retrieved a folded slip of pale green stationery. The handwriting was tight, angular, continental in its economy. "If she fails the transformation, remove her to Belgium. A second passage will be arranged. Do not destroy the mask, it may serve again." S. Holmes set the letter down. "We have always assumed Carraway led the circle, that it was his vision, his cruelty, his artistry. But this note, marked simply S, reveals something else, a superior, a patron, perhaps even the founder." I stepped forward. "And you believe this S still lives?" Holmes nodded. "Not only lives, operates." Quietly, cleverly. With reach far beyond Richmond, he stood suddenly and moved to the bureau, retrieving from a drawer a long, narrow box. Within it, wrapped in silk, was the final object recovered from the vault, the second veil, unworn, untouched. Holmes held it by its corner, letting the black silk unfurl like a falling shadow. This was meant for another. Not Alice, not Lydia, someone else. Someone we haven't yet named. He turned to me. I believe the final bride was never chosen. I stared at him. "You mean—" "Yes," he said. "The veil was prepared in advance. The marriage not yet arranged, the identity not yet harvested. This house was a staging ground, Watson, not a conclusion. And Carraway, he was already grooming the next subject." My throat felt dry. "Do we know who?" Holmes crossed to the desk and picked up one of the few remaining unopened boxes. He sliced it open with his penknife and drew forth a sheaf of notes, uncharacteristically disorganized. At the bottom, a photograph. It was recent. Taken in what appeared to be a marketplace, possibly in Vienna. A woman stood near a flower stall, a white scarf over her hair. Her face was not fully visible, but in the corner of the image was Carraway himself watching her. Holmes flipped over the photograph. Written in the same precise hand was a name, Clara S. I frowned. "Not Langford?" Holmes shook his head. "No relation to Alice, as far as I can tell. But note the surname's initial. S." He moved to the fireplace and removed the earlier letter. "Watson, what if S is not a superior, but a signature?" "A brand?" I hesitated. "You mean all the women were being prepared to become One woman? Not quite, Holmes said. They were being prepared for someone. Or into someone. A position, perhaps. An heiress. A diplomat's wife. A political pawn. We must stop thinking of these as marriages. They are installations, sleeper identities. I felt the weight of the idea settle into the room like dust. "And what about Carraway?" I asked. "Does he know this?" Holmes's expression darkened. "He knows only his portion. He believes he is the artist, the puppeteer, but he's merely the stagehand. Trusted, yes, but expendable. And now that he's failed—" He glanced toward the window, where the rain continued to trace runes on the glass. They will cut the string. We went to Newgate the next morning. Carraway had been moved to the high-security wing, where he remained under close observation. His condition had stabilized, but he had yet to speak a single word. When we entered his cell, he was seated upright, his hands folded, his expression as neutral as a wax figure's. Only the slight twitch in his left eye betrayed awareness. Holmes stepped forward. "You were never meant to succeed, were you?" No reply. "You were sent to Richmond because you were efficient. A specialist, a mask maker, but you let your subjects falter. You allowed memory to return. That was your true failure. Still nothing." Holmes drew the photograph of Clara S. from his pocket and laid it on the table before Carraway. His eye twitched again. "She is the next." Was to be, at least. But now her image is compromised. That will not be forgiven. Holmes leaned in. "Tell me who she is, who they are, and I may yet spare you the noose." Carraway turned his head slowly. His lips parted, cracked and bloodless, and then, in a voice like parchment tearing, he whispered, "You are already wearing a mask, Holmes." Holmes stepped back, shaken for the first time. Carraway smiled, not kindly. Holmes said nothing more. We left in silence. That evening, Holmes sat again with the second veil across his lap. He stared into the fire as though willing the flames to reveal something missed, some angle, some fracture in the circle. At last, he said, "Watson, there's a second location." I looked up. "Another house?" "Another vault." He gestured to the burned seal, the needle over the flame. "It is not a symbol of destruction," he said. "It is a brand of refinement. There is a place where they make the veils, Watson, and where they perfect the final name." I felt a chill. "And where is it?" Holmes stood. "I don't know yet. But when I find it, I believe we'll meet the real bride." He looked toward the window once more, voice low. "And I don't think she wants to be found." The fog that clung to London in those early November days seemed to have seeped from the vaults beneath Richmond, thick, sour, and stubborn. It smothered the gas lamps, dulled the clang of carriage wheels, and hung like a curtain over the city's secrets. Holmes had not slept. For 2 nights he had paced our sitting room in rhythmic silence, pausing only to adjust the positioning of files or to scribble arcane calculations across the margins of women's names: Clara S., Therese H., Marguerite L. I had grown familiar with his moods over the years, but this one was rare. Not obsession, that was a constant, but something quieter, more grave. He had once told me that true evil did not shout or stab, it whispered, and in this case, he was listening. On the third morning, as dawn threatened behind the fog, Holmes finally spoke. The photograph of Clara S. was not taken in Vienna. I looked up from my tea. "You're certain?" "I am." "Note the flower stall in the corner. The awning bears the name de Fleury. A florist of some repute operates exclusively from Antwerp." He rose and crossed to the globe, spinning it slowly. "There was a fire in Antwerp last year. A church was destroyed, the Church of St. Margareta. The bride who wore two veils, that phrase, appears first in a local poem composed after the fire. It was about a woman, mistaken for someone else and buried under the wrong name. I stood. You think that's the origin of the circle? No. Holmes stopped the globe. I believe that's where the circle turned inward. Where identity became ritual, he opened a drawer and retrieved a letter we had received the night before from Lestrade. Inside was confirmation that Carraway's final subject, Clara S., had indeed lived in Antwerp and that she had recently vanished. Vanished after a scheduled appointment at a tailor's studio known for theatrical costuming, the tailor's name, S. de Fleury. 2 days later, we were in Antwerp under assumed names. Holmes had taken the guise of a university ethnographer interested in local customs and mourning rituals. I was his assistant, recently discharged from service. The ruse was simple, and we had worn it often. The city met us in muted grey, cobbled streets slick with drizzle, canals slow and quiet, buildings stained with age. There was a watchfulness to Antwerp, as if the walls remembered things better left unspoken. We found the studio of de Fleury at the end of a narrow alley, nestled between an apothecary and a shuttered café. The windows were frosted with age, and a single bell tinkled as we entered. Inside, mannequins stood like mourners at a procession, draped in bridal gowns, mourning garb, and ceremonial attire. The scent of old linen and beeswax filled the air. A woman emerged from the back. Her hair was silver and pulled into a severe bun, her dress black, her eyes pale as quartz. "May I assist you?" she asked in perfect English. Holmes bowed slightly. "We are told you specialize in veils." Her lips curled faintly. "Veils are symbols, monsieur, for mourning, for mystery, and for transformation." "Exactly," Holmes said. "We seek one that conceals not merely the face, but the past." The woman's expression did not change, but her tone did. "You've come from London," she said. It was not a question. Holmes nodded. "You seek the bride who wore two veils," she said, "but she no longer exists." "She was never meant to exist," Holmes replied. "She was meant to become someone else." The woman stepped closer. "Do you believe a name is enough to make a person?" "No," Holmes said, "but erasing one does not unmake the soul beneath." She studied him, then turned and walked to a side curtain. She drew it back slowly. Behind it stood a final mannequin. It wore no dress, only a veil, the same black silk. Holmes stepped forward and lifted the edge. The mannequin's head had no face, only a blank porcelain orb, no eyes, no mouth, no features. "She was never given a final name," the woman said behind us, "only trained to wear them." Holmes lowered the veil. "Clara?" The woman nodded. "She was brought here." "Not by Carraway, but by another." He called himself Sebastian. Tall, fair, with a burn scar on his palm. He said she was a gift, that she was ready for the last veil. Holmes's hands clenched. "Where is she now?" The woman looked at me. "She refused the transformation." Holmes paled. "You killed her?" "No," she said. "She chose to burn the mask." She stepped back and opened a drawer. From it, she withdrew a letter, sealed in wax. She left this. For the man who found the vault, Holmes took it, broke the seal. Inside was a single sheet of paper. "I chose my name. I chose my face. Let them make others if they must. But I am no longer theirs. If they come for me again, let them know. I remember who I was. And that is enough." C.S. Holmes closed the letter slowly. "She escaped." The woman nodded. "We don't all wear the veil forever. Some of us take it off in time." He turned to her. "Then the circle is broken?" She shook her head. "No, only frayed. Another will try to weave it again, but you've made it harder." Holmes stared at the mannequin once more. "And the others?" Gone, she said. Some to silence, some to truth. Holmes bowed. Thank you. As we stepped back into the cold Antwerp street, Holmes clutched the letter as if it were a life-preserver. He did not speak again until we were at the train station, our return to London already arranged. She ended it, he murmured. Clara S. broke the ritual by choosing herself. Yes, I said, but there are others, Holmes. We still don't know who led them, or what else they planned. He looked at me, weary but resolute. We know this much, Watson. The circle only lives when the name is taken. If we help the others remember who they were. He tucked the letter into his coat. The circle will vanish. Not with fire, but with memory, and as the train pulled away from the city, Holmes closed his eyes, not in sleep, but in thought. For once, he was not hunting. He was remembering.